The wind in the Colorado mountains had a way of speaking. It whistled low through the cottonwoods, rattled the shutters with its cold fingers, and pressed itself against the windows of the Reeves family home like a restless spirit. Margaret Reeves had listened to that wind for more than 50 years, and in its voice she often heard memory. The clang of a hammer, the laughter of children tumbling down the hill in winter snow, the sound of her husband Daniel calling her name from the porch he built with his own hands. At 81, Margaret's pace had slowed, but her senses remained sharp. She knew when the mountain weather was about to turn by the taste of iron in the air. She knew when the deer would come down from the ridge to forage in her garden, and she knew without a shadow of doubt that she had not placed the envelope sitting on her kitchen table that morning. Her hands, still steady despite the years, rested on the back of a chair as she stared at it. A plain envelope, white, crisp edges, not softened by a mailbox, nor smudged by weather. It had been placed here, inside, by someone who carried a key. Richard, her eldest son, had always kept one. For emergencies, he'd said when Daniel passed 10 years ago. But Richard's emergencies had never been hers. Margaret set her bag of groceries on the counter. Though her apples rolled dangerously close to the edge, she didn't care. Her eyes remained fixed on the letter. Slowly, she sat down, her knees aching as she lowered herself into the oak chair that had stood in this kitchen. Since 1972, she broke the seal with a butter knife. "Mom," it began. The word felt foreign. Not mother, not mama, as he had once cried when storms frightened him as a boy. Just the clipped, distant mom. "We need to discuss the house. Clara and I have decided it's time to sell. The property is too much for you now. We've already spoken with a realtor. Buyers are interested. You don't need to worry about the details. We'll explain everything when we come by this week." Margaret read the lines twice, then a third time, before her eyes blurred with something hotter than tears. They had decided, without her. She pressed the paper flat against the table and forced herself to breathe. Her gaze drifted around the kitchen. The cracked tiles Daniel had laid one by one, the curtains she had sewn when Clara was still small enough to hide behind them, and the grandfather clock ticking solemnly in the corner. Every object in this room was soaked with years of living. How could her children reduce it all to paperwork? Her chest tightened. She rose slowly, gripping the edge of the table for balance, and walked into the living room. The stone fireplace loomed silent, the hearth swept clean since winter's last fire. On its mantel sat a battered tin box, its paint chipped, its lid slightly bent. Margaret reached for it with both hands. The weight was familiar, heavier with meaning than with metal. She carried it back to the table and opened it, the hinges squealing in protest. Inside lay folded linens of paper, old photographs, a pressed flower Daniel had once given her, and beneath them the deed, the real deed. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it, not from weakness, but from the rush of memory. Years ago, Daniel had insisted they prepare a safeguard, something hidden from public record. "You never know," he'd said, his voice low as he signed the extra clause. "People change, circumstances change. Promise me, Maggie, if they ever try to take what's ours, you'll be ready." She hadn't argued. Daniel's foresight had guided them through droughts and layoffs, through Clara's hospital stay as a child, and through Richard's tuition, when law school nearly bankrupted them. If he wanted a safeguard, he had earned the right to insist. A trusted friend from church notarized the addendum quietly, away from prying eyes, and the document has rested here ever since. Margaret traced her husband's handwriting in the margins, firm, deliberate strokes that had not faded with time. Daniel had been gone 10 years, but in this moment, she felt him close, as though he were standing just behind her, hand on her shoulder, steady as ever. She replaced the papers carefully and closed the tin box with a decisive snap. Her children believed they had won. They thought her old, tired, and incapable of resistance, but they did not know the truth. "They'll never find it," Margaret whispered to the empty kitchen. "Not unless I give it to them." The house creaked in the wind, as though in agreement. Shadows shifted across the wooden floorboards. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling in from the Rockies like cavalry on the march. Margaret looked again at Richard's letter, still lying on the table. Her children thought they were the ones making decisions. They thought they had the power, but Margaret Reeves still held the deed. And Margaret Reeves was not finished. The storm broke over the valley that evening, rain lashing against the tin roof in furious bursts. Margaret sat in the living room, the old tin box once again tucked safely on the mantel, her eyes fixed on the flickering lamplight. The letter from Richard lay folded on the table beside her, its words seared into her thoughts. Her children would arrive soon, Richard, with his polished shoes and lawyer's tone, and Clara, with her sharp perfume and sharper tongue. They would expect her to yield. They would smile as though it were all for her own good. But Margaret had weathered storms fiercer than this one. She leaned back in her chair, letting her mind wander to the early days. The house had been nothing more than a foundation and 4 beams. When Daniel first led her onto the land, she had doubted him. How could 2 young people, with little more than grit and borrowed money, raise a home from dirt and pine? But Daniel had placed a hand on her belly, where Richard grew strong, and promised, "We'll build it together. For us. For them." She remembered holding boards in the wind while Daniel hammered nails with frozen fingers. She remembered Clara toddling across the half-finished floor, her giggle echoing through bare rafters. She remembered David, the youngest, drawing pictures of the house in his school notebooks, calling it forever. And now, forever was for sale. Margaret rose and moved to the kitchen window. Outside, the storm thrashed the garden where Daniel had once planted tomatoes. Water streaked down the glass, blurring the view of the cottonwoods that guarded the edge of the property. She pressed her palm against the cool pane, whispering to the night, "Not yet. They won't take it yet." The doorbell rang. She startled, clutching her chest. It was too late for visitors. She shuffled to the door, her slippers silent against the wood floor, and pulled it open. Clara stood there, her umbrella dripping, her coat immaculate despite the weather. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, shaking the rain from her hair. "Mother," she said, her voice crisp, "we need to talk." Margaret stiffened. "Where's Richard?" "On his way," Clara replied, glancing around the room with critical eyes. "Honestly, Mother, this house it's falling apart. The roof, the wiring, the foundation. It's not safe for you." Margaret bristled. "This house has stood longer than most marriages, longer than your career, Clara. It doesn't need your approval." Clara sighed, setting her purse on the table. "We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help. You can't maintain this place alone. Selling is the practical choice." "Practical," Margaret echoed, tasting the word like ash. The door opened again, and Richard entered, shaking rain from his coat. He greeted his sister with a nod before turning to Margaret. His expression was firm, businesslike. "Mother, we'll keep this simple. The realtor is ready. Buyers are lined up. All we need is your agreement." Margaret crossed her arms. "And if I don't agree?" Richard set his briefcase on the table and opened it, sliding papers across the surface. "Then we proceed without you. Legally, Clara and I have the authority. David has already signed his portion." Margaret's heart sank. David, the baby, the one who had once clung to her skirts and begged for stories, had already betrayed her. She masked the pain with steel in her voice. "You've planned this well, too well." Richard leaned forward. "This is for your safety. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Clara placed a manicured hand on Margaret's arm. "Think of it as letting go, Mother, one less burden." Margaret pulled her arm away. "This house is not a burden. It is blood, sweat, and memory, and you'll not take it while I still breathe." The storm outside thundered, shaking the windows. The 3 of them stood in silence, the sound of rain filling the room. At last, Richard exhaled, sliding the papers back into his case. "We'll give you until the end of the week. After that, the sale moves forward with or without your blessing." They left together, their footsteps echoing down the porch steps, their car lights fading into the storm. Margaret remained at the table, her hand resting on the tin box hidden above the fireplace. "They'll never find it," she whispered again, stronger this time. For now, she still had the deed. For now, the house was hers. But she knew the battle had only begun. The storm cleared by morning, leaving the Colorado air sharp and bright, as though the sky had been scrubbed clean. The mountains rose, jagged and white against the horizon, and the Reeves house stood in its valley like an aging sentinel, weathered, stubborn, unyielding. Margaret woke before dawn, her sleep restless. The echoes of her children's words still haunted her. "We've already spoken with a realtor. Buyers are lined up. David has already signed." Each phrase replayed in her mind like a hammer striking wood. She brewed tea, the kettle whistling in the quiet house, and sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the cup. The tin box rested on the mantel in the next room, its weight pressing against her thoughts. Daniel's foresight was her only weapon now, but could she wield it? Richard would dismiss it. Clara would sneer. David would sell it for pocket change. As the sun broke over the ridgeline, a knock sounded at the door. Margaret tensed, her mind flashing to Richard, but when she opened it, she found Mrs. Alvarez, her neighbor of 30 years, standing with a basket of muffins. "Thought you might want breakfast," Mrs. Alvarez said warmly, stepping inside. Her eyes, however, flicked to Margaret's face and lingered there. "You look troubled." Margaret hesitated, then poured tea for them both. "My children, they want to sell the house, without me." Mrs. Alvarez's brow furrowed. "They can't do that." "They think they can," Margaret replied, her voice low. "But Daniel, he prepared something. A safeguard." She didn't reveal the deed, not yet, but speaking of it out loud was enough to steady her. Mrs. Alvarez reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Don't let them bully you, Margaret. You've lived your whole life in this valley. People here know the truth. This is your home." Her words settled like embers in Margaret's chest. Perhaps, she thought, witnesses would matter more than signatures. By noon, Richard returned, this time with the realtor, a thin man with a too-wide smile. He introduced himself as Mr. Dwyer. He wore a tailored suit ill-suited to mountain weather and carried a folder thicker than his arm. "Mrs. Reeves," he said with oily charm, "I've heard so much about this beautiful property. You should be proud. Buyers are very eager. We can secure a strong offer within days." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "This house isn't for sale." Richard stepped forward. "Mother, let's not start this again. We've explained." "No," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp. "You've declared, you've dictated. That's different from explaining." Mr. Dwyer cleared his throat, opening his folder. "With all due respect, ma'am, your children have already initiated proceedings. Your consent is a formality." Margaret's chest burned. She turned to Richard. "A formality? You bring a stranger into my home and expect me to hand over 50 years of my life as a formality?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Mother, please don't embarrass yourself." It was then that the door creaked open again, and Clara entered. She was dressed for battle heels, pearls, and a silk blouse that glimmered in the light. "We thought it best to move quickly," she said smoothly. "Buyers are coming tomorrow to view the property." Margaret nearly dropped her teacup. "Tomorrow?" "Yes," Clara said, her smile tight. "You'll stay out of the way. It's easier for everyone." Margaret's mind raced. Tomorrow. They were accelerating, pushing her into a corner before she could act. She steadied her breath, forcing calm into her voice. "Then tomorrow," she said slowly, "I'll show them what this house really is." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" But Margaret offered no answer. Instead, she excused herself, climbing the creaking stairs to her bedroom. Behind her, the murmurs of her children and Mr. Dwyer echoed through the halls like conspirators plotting in the dark. In her room, Margaret pulled the tin box from beneath the mantel and set it on her quilt. She opened it carefully, her fingers brushing the folded deed. Daniel's words came back to her. "Protect what we built. Promise me, Maggie." She thought of the buyers walking through tomorrow, guided by Richard's speeches and Clara's curated charm. But what if the truth were laid bare instead? What if the valley neighbors, the ones who had seen her tend this land, who had shared harvests and winters, were invited to witnesses, not chosen by her children, but by her? For the first time in days, Margaret smiled. Not the smile of surrender, but of strategy. Tomorrow would not be theirs. Tomorrow would be hers. The next day dawned with a false brightness, the kind that often came before a late spring storm in Colorado. The mountains gleamed under the sun, but the wind carried a bite that promised trouble. Margaret Reeves stood at her kitchen sink, her hands resting on the porcelain edge, staring out at the cottonwoods, swaying in the distance. Today would decide whether her children's betrayal hardened into permanence or whether she still had the power to turn the tide. She had risen before dawn to prepare. The floors were swept, the curtains washed and pressed, and the scent of baking bread filled the house. But these were not gestures of hospitality. They were acts of defiance. If buyers were coming, they would not see a crumbling relic ready for demolition. They would see a living home, tended and treasured. At 10 o'clock sharp, the first cars arrived. A sleek black sedan rolled up the gravel drive. Followed by a silver SUV, Richard emerged from the sedan in his navy suit, papers tucked under his arm. Clara followed from the SUV, heels clicking as though the gravel itself should bend to her will. Behind them came two strangers, a couple in their 40s, city-polished, their eyes scanning the property with hungry calculation. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, her gray cardigan wrapped tight, her chin lifted high. "Good morning," she said evenly, though her pulse hammered. "Mother," Richard said stiffly, gesturing to the couple. "This is Mr. and Mrs. Callahan. They're interested in purchasing the property. We'll be showing them around." "Interested," Margaret repeated softly, her gaze sharp. "Well, let's see if they're interested in the truth." Clara rolled her eyes but plastered on a smile for the buyers. "You'll love the view from the back porch," she said, ushering them toward the door. But before they could enter, a second set of cars pulled up. Dusk rose as old pickups and battered sedans lined the drive. Out stepped Mrs. Alvarez, the Fitzgeralds' Pastor Miller from the local church, and half a dozen more neighbors, people who had known Margaret for decades. They carried no briefcases, no contracts, only their presence. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Mother, what is this?" "Witnesses," Margaret replied simply. "If my home is to be paraded, then let the people who have seen it and lived in it bear witness too." Clara hissed under her breath, but the buyers, perhaps intrigued by the sudden audience, followed Margaret inside. The neighbors trailed after, filling the rooms with murmurs of recognition. "This is where Daniel held Sunday suppers," Mrs. Alvarez told the Callahans as they stepped into the dining room. "We'd bring pies, and he'd play his fiddle after dinner." "In this very kitchen," Pastor Miller added, "Margaret cooked for the fire crew during the '89 blaze, fed 30 men with nothing but beans and bread." The Callahans exchanged glances, clearly unsettled. This was not the sterile tour they expected. Margaret moved steadily through each room, pointing not to flaws, but to memories. "Here," she said in the living room, "Daniel and I laid every stone in that fireplace. It took us to Winters, and upstairs, the beams my children etched their names into them when they were small." You'll see. When they reached the back porch, the valley spread wide before them, cottonwoods shimmering in the wind. Margaret gestured out across the land. "Daniel planted every one of those trees with his own hands." And there she pointed toward the small rise where wildflowers bloomed. "That S where we buried our first dog, Jasper." My children cried for a week. This house isn't just walls. It's a life carved into the soil. Silence followed. Even Clara's polished charm faltered under the weight of so much history. The buyers whispered to one another, their confidence shaken. Finally, Mrs. Callahan cleared her throat. "It's a beautiful property, but perhaps too personal for us." Richard's jaw tightened. "Don't let sentiment sway you. The land alone is worth." But the buyers were already retreating, thanking him politely, clearly unwilling to step further into a home that breathed so vividly of another family's soul. As their car pulled away, Margaret turned to her children. "You may bring all the buyers you like, but this house will not be sold without a fight." And now she gestured toward the neighbors clustered behind her. "You have witnesses to prove it." The neighbors nodded, murmuring their support. Mrs. Alvarez squeezed Margaret's hand, whispering, "They won't win, not with us watching." Richard snapped his briefcase shut, his composure cracking. "This isn't over." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're only delaying the inevitable, Mother." Margaret met their eyes, steady and unflinching. "Or perhaps I've already begun the inevitable, because the truth is stronger than your signatures, and the truth has a deed." The words struck like thunder. Her children paled, though they tried to mask it. None of them yet knew where the deed was hidden, but they knew now that their mother was not powerless. And in that moment, Margaret Reeves realized something profound. She was not merely defending her home. She was defending her dignity, her memory, and her very right to exist on her own terms. The storm outside had passed, but inside, the battle had just begun. The day after the failed showing, the Reeves house sat heavy with silence. Margaret felt it in her bones, the stillness of a battlefield before the next attack. She moved slowly through the rooms, touching the worn edges of furniture, the photographs that lined the hallway, the quilts folded neatly on the cedar chest. These weren't decorations. They were proof of a life lived, but her children did not see them that way. To Richard, the oak banister was nothing but dated woodwork. To Clara, the quilts were clutter. They didn't see memory. They saw market value. By mid-afternoon, the storm came not of weather, but of wheels crunching gravel on the drive. 2 cars again. This time, Richard and Clara emerged together, their steps purposeful, their expressions carved from stone. Richard carried his leather briefcase, thicker than before, while Clara held a portfolio stuffed with glossy brochures. Margaret met them at the door, her cardigan buttoned, her chin lifted. "You're early," she said coolly. Richard brushed past her into the living room, spreading papers across the coffee table. We're done with games, Mother. Yesterday was a stunt. Today, we settle this properly. Clara closed the door behind her, her perfume filling the air. The buyers weren't scared off by sentiment. They were embarrassed. You made this house look like a shrine. No one wants to buy grief. No, Margaret replied, her voice steady. No one wants to buy lies either. Richard ignored her, flipping open a binder. We've prepared contracts. The realtor has backup buyers. All we need is your acknowledgement. If you refuse, we will proceed with litigation. The courts will recognize your inability to maintain the property, and they'll side with us. It's inevitable. Margaret sank into her chair, folding her hands in her lap. Her heart pounded, but her eyes did not waver. You underestimate me, Richard. You always have. Clara knelt before her, her voice softening like a blade hidden in velvet. Mother, why are you clinging to this? Think of yourself. You're alone here. Winters are harsh. You deserve comfort, not struggle. We're not stealing, we're saving you. Margaret studied her daughter's face, the same face she had wiped clean of paint when Clara was a child, the same hands she had guided to hold a paintbrush steady. Now those hands were painted with polish, reaching not to create, but to take. You speak of saving, Margaret whispered, but what you mean is erasing. Erasing me. Richard slammed his palm on the table. Enough. We're not here for speeches. We're here to resolve this legally. You have no choice. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Margaret rose slowly, her knees aching, and opened it to find David standing there. The youngest, Reeves' child, her wild one, her dreamer. His hair was unkempt, his suit wrinkled, and his eyes carried the heavy shadow of debt. He stepped inside, avoiding his mother's gaze. You signed, Margaret said quietly, the words heavier than stone. David swallowed hard. I didn't want to, Ma. But Richard said, it was already decided. He promised me a share. Enough to clear what I owe. Her heart broke all over again, but she lifted her chin. And when that's gone, David, what then? Will you sell me next? David flinched. Richard interjected quickly. Mother, don't manipulate him. He made his choice. But Margaret was no longer looking at Richard. Her eyes moved to the mantel, to the tin box resting in plain sight. She let her gaze linger there, long enough for Clara to follow it. Clara's breath caught. What is that? She asked. Margaret turned slowly, her voice calm but carrying the weight of thunder. That, she said, is something you'll never find unless I want you to. The room froze. Richard's eyes narrowed. Clara stepped closer, her face pale. David looked between them all, his confusion growing. What are you hiding, Mother? Richard demanded. Margaret smiled faintly. Not hiding, guarding. There's a difference. Clara's voice rose, sharp and brittle. What is it? Documents, money, another will. Margaret didn't answer. She returned to her chair, folded her hands once more, and said only, You think you've cornered me, but you've forgotten one thing. Your father prepared for this day, and I kept his promise. Richard's composure cracked. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. What are you talking about? Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that filled the room like a drumbeat. The real deed, the one that proves this house cannot be sold without me. The silence that followed was electric. Clara staggered back, her hand clutching her chest. David stared, stunned. Richard, ever the lawyer, tried to recover, but his voice faltered. You're bluffing. Margaret's smile deepened. Am I? She did not move toward the box. She did not need to. The suggestion alone had shifted the ground beneath them. They had come armed with contracts and threats. She had answered with a truth they had not anticipated. The storm outside rattled the windows, wind howling down the valley. Inside, the storm in the Reeves family raged fiercer still, and Margaret knew the next move was theirs, but the power was hers. The storm that evening seemed to mirror the one brewing inside the Reeves house. Thunder rolled across the mountains, flashes of lightning cutting the sky into jagged fragments. Inside, the living room was lit only by the fire in the hearth, its glow flickering across the tense faces of mother and children. Richard sat at the table, papers spread like weapons before him. His jaw was tight, his pen tapping against the wood with an impatience that made the neighbor's clock on the mantel tick louder by comparison. Clara paced the room, her heels striking sharp notes against the floorboards. David slumped on the couch, head in his hands, as though he had already lost a battle no one had yet declared over. Margaret sat in her armchair, the tin box resting on her lap. She had placed it there deliberately, in plain sight, as if daring them to lunge for it. Her fingers traced the lid slowly, calmly, her eyes never leaving her children. "You can't bluff forever," Richard said finally, his voice low and hard. "If that's really what you claim it is, then show us. Otherwise, we proceed tomorrow. The contracts are ready. The buyers are still interested." Clara stopped pacing and turned, her eyes flashing. "She's manipulating us, Richard. She's always been good at that guilt sentiment, all those stories about Dad. But it won't work anymore. We're not children." Margaret's voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "You may not be children, but you've forgotten how to be family." David groaned, his voice hoarse. "Can we not do this, please? I just need this to end." Margaret's heart twisted, but she did not soften. "End," she repeated. "You want it to end by selling the only place that has ever kept you safe, by erasing every sacrifice your father made." Richard slammed his fist onto the table, the papers scattering. "This isn't about sacrifice, it's about reality. You can't live here alone anymore. You can barely climb the stairs. This house is a liability. And you," Margaret countered, "are a disappointment." The words hung heavy in the air. Clara gasped. David lifted his head. Richard froze, the insult cutting deeper than he expected. Margaret leaned forward, her voice rising with fire. "Your father built this house with his own hands. He trusted you to honor it. Instead, you treat it like currency to be traded. You think you can push me aside and bury me alive before I'm gone, but you forget Daniel Reeves was no fool, and neither am I." She lifted the tin box, holding it high so the firelight glinted off its surface. "The deed is here. The real deed. Not filed where you think, not hidden where you'd look. Signed, witnessed, binding. Without it, your contracts mean nothing. Without it, you have nothing." Clara's face drained of color. "You're lying." Margaret set the box back on her lap, patting it once. "Am I?" Richard stood, his composure cracking. "If that's true, then show us. Open it." Margaret smiled faintly. "No, not yet. You'll see it when the time is right, when the witnesses are present, when the truth must be laid bare, not before. You don't get to dictate that." The fire popped, sending sparks upward. The storm outside rattled the windows again. Inside, the silence stretched until even the clock seemed hesitant to tick. Clara's voice trembled as she broke it. "Do you realize what you're doing? You're turning us into enemies. Your own children." Margaret's eyes glistened. "No, Clara. You did that yourselves." David shot to his feet, running a hand through his hair. "Enough. I can't take this anymore. I didn't want to sign, but I did. And now I'm trapped between all of you. You're tearing this family apart." Margaret stood slowly, setting the tin box back on the mantel. She placed a hand on David's shoulder, her touch gentle. "You were always my dreamer, David. But even dreamers must choose where they stand. Will you stand with greed or with memory?" He looked at her, tears pooling in his eyes, but said nothing. Richard gathered his papers angrily, snapping his briefcase shut. "Enough of this charade. Tomorrow, I'll bring the contracts to the courthouse. If you want to wave around your little box, do it then. Until that moment, this means nothing." He strode to the door, Clara following in his wake, her perfume lingering bitterly in the air. David remained behind, silent, staring at the floor. Margaret returned to her chair, the fire warming her face. She whispered to herself, to Daniel, and to the house that had held them all. "They think they've won, but they don't know what they've never found." Her hand touched the box once more, steady and sure. Tomorrow would decide everything. The courthouse in town was an old red brick building, its clock tower rising above the clustered shops and of Main Street. On that cold morning, Margaret Reeves walked its steps with her head high, her cane clicking against the stone. The tin box was in her hands, cradled like a child, and every step she took seemed to echo against the walls of the mountain valley. Inside, the room was already filling. Richard sat at the front table, his navy suit crisp, his jaw set, papers fanned before him like a general's battle map. Clara perched beside him, her pearl earrings glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. David lingered near the back, torn, wringing his hands. The realtor, Mr. Dwyer, stood smugly in the corner, ready to declare victory. And in the gallery, neighbors, Mrs. Alvarez, Pastor Miller, the Fitzgeralds, a dozen more who had come out of loyalty and curiosity. Witnesses, Margaret's chosen army. When she entered, a hush fell. The bailiff guided her to a seat at the front. She set the tin box on the table with deliberate care. its metal lid catching the light. Richard's eyes flicked to it, his confidence faltering for just a heartbeat. The judge, a broad-shouldered man with years etched into his face, adjusted his glasses. "We here to consider the matter of the Reeves property and the petition to sell filed by Richard and Clara Reeves. With consent from David Reeves, Margaret Reeves, widow of the late Daniel Reeves, contests the sale. Let us proceed." Richard rose smoothly, his lawyer's cadence polished and rehearsed. "Your Honor, my mother's age and health make it impossible for her to maintain this property safely. My siblings and I have agreed responsibly that the sale is necessary. We have buyers prepared, contracts drawn. This is the practical and lawful solution." He sat. Clara gave a small nod of approval. Then the judge turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Reeves, do you have a response?" Margaret stood slowly, leaning on her cane, her voice steady but carrying to the farthest corner. "Your Honor, my children would have you believe this house is just timber and land, but it is more than that. It is memory, sacrifice, and promise." "And promises," she said, her hand resting on the tin box, "must be honored." Gasps rustled through the gallery. Richard shot to his feet. "Objection. Sentiment does not override law." The judge raised a hand. "Proceed." "Mrs. Reeves." Margaret opened the tin box. The creak of its hinges cut through the silence. From within, she withdrew the folded deed, yellowed with age but sealed with ink and signatures. Her hands did not tremble as she passed it to the bailiff. "This," she declared, "is the real deed. Signed by my husband, witnessed, notarized, and preserved. It stipulates that the Reeves property cannot be sold without the explicit consent of both spouses, living or deceased, and in the event of death, the surviving spouse retains full authority. Daniel knew this day might come. He trusted me to protect what we built, and I intend to keep that trust." The bailiff carried the paper to the judge, who examined it closely. The courtroom was silent except for the rustle of parchment. Finally, the judge looked up, his voice grave. "The signatures are valid. The notary seal is intact. This document supersedes the petition. Without Mrs. Reeves' consent, the sale cannot proceed." The room erupted, neighbors whispering, Clara palling, Richard's composure shattering. David covered his face with his hands, torn between relief and shame. "No," Richard barked, stepping forward. This isn't legal. It's ancient. It is binding." The judge interrupted firmly. "Your petition is denied. This case is closed." The gavel struck, final and echoing. Margaret exhaled slowly, a weight lifting from her chest. She turned to look at her children. Clara's eyes glistened, her lips trembling as though she might cry, but refused. Richard stood rigid, furious but defeated. And David met her gaze with something softer. Regret, maybe even love. Mrs. Alvarez caught Margaret's hand as she walked out, whispering, "You did it. You kept your promise." Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes on the mountains visible through the courthouse windows. "No," she whispered back. "Daniel did. I just remembered." That evening, she returned to the house. The storm had passed, the sky was clear, and the mountains were glowing pink in the sunset. She set the tin box back on the mantel, the deed inside once more, and sat by the fire. The house creaked softly around her, its beams and walls alive with memory. It was still hers, always hers. And as the night settled in, Margaret whispered to the empty room, to her husband, to herself, "They tried to sell my life without me, but they never found the real deed."